Say goodbye to what you know. We're all sitting here at home, thinking about the times that we would sit together. All the things we thought would count, they have no meaning to us now. All we got is who we have inside our homes. But tell me, when this is done and we go back to life, will we remember?
I'm Donald Ray Nelson. I was born in Long Beach, California in 1943. My mom's name was Leona Marie Nelson, but she was known as Babe Nelson. And my dad was Arnold Harold Nelson, I think his middle name was. Jack was my stepfather. That was my mom's second husband and her last husband. He was I have to admit, he was a very good father. The only father I knew. And I have to admit, he was strict. He was a very religious man. He constantly, he'd sit in his easy chair and he'd read the Bible just about every night. And I used to ask him, why do you read the Bible so much? And he would say, because he's searching for the truth. And anyway, he said that he's been a Catholic all his life, but he really didn't believe a lot of the teachings of the Catholic Church, but he didn't know what religion taught the truth. And so he searched on his own in the Bible to try to find the answer to his questions that he had. Like I say, he was a strict father. He wasn't a mean father or abusive father, but he went by Bible rules, and he was very, very conscientious about how he raised his family. I remember he used to tell us he didn't know what the true religion was, but we had to have some kind of religion in our life, so we went to various churches trying to see what they were like, you know. One thing that he did was he felt that we needed to be taught responsibility, so when we were in high school, one of the things that he required was we either had to work at one of his businesses or we had to pay rent. And he said that he thought that was a good way to teach responsibility to us. Now, I remember when we paid rent, I didn't like it. That was money that I could have used for other things, but after I got up in age and got a lot older, I could see the benefit of it. It did teach me responsibility. So I appreciate that as well. My stepdad, he was Portuguese, Mexican, French, and Indian. That was his nationalities. He wasn't an educated man, that is school educated. I remember he used to say he only went to the third grade. He lived in the mountains above Las Vegas somewhere, and he didn't have much schooling. He was basically home taught himself. But I have to admit, he was a very business-minded man, because he was a general contractor, so he had that business, and he also had 2 Shell gas stations, which were businesses that he operated. So he was a very business-minded man. When we were growing up, I can remember we, as a family, we picnicked a lot, an awful lot, and then also we were into camping a lot, going into the mountains and camping for days at a time, and that was something that all of us really enjoyed. So that was an interest we had. Even as I got older, had my family, we camped a lot as well. When I was in high school, I wasn't what you might call an exceptionally good student. I was an average student, but I did like to play baseball a lot. All through high school, I played on the baseball team. I was the captain of the baseball team, and I remember one year I guess it was my senior year, I was scouted by one of the baseball scouts for the Chicago White Sox, but I wasn't really interested in filling yeah, the career. I did play a lot of city league baseball after high school because I enjoyed the sport so much, but I never pursued it. The girl that became my wife, I met. I was just out of high school, and I think she was a senior in high school. It wasn't the same town. She lived about, I think it was 6 miles away from the town that I grew up in. I met her through one of her girlfriends, who the girlfriend had a crush on me and wanted to introduce her to me, so she did. And when she introduced to me, I asked her if she wanted to go out. And so we went out, and I don't know what, I dated her for about 5 or 6 weeks, and I decided in my mind, this girl, I'm going to see if I can marry her someday, which I did. After I got out of high school, I worked a few years. Then we got into about, I'd say, the peak of the Vietnam War, and I knew I was probably going to get drafted, and eventually I did get drafted. When I was about I think it was 19 years old, I got drafted. And by then I was quite religious for a young man. As you may know, the sixth commandment is thou shalt not murder. Murder is defined as taking the life of another human, willfully taking the life of another human. And really that's what war is. And my conscience wouldn't allow me to harm a person anyway, in any way. But definitely I wasn't going to take the life of another person. So as a youngster, I objected to the war. I didn't believe in it. Yeah, I thought it was wrong. And so I fought it in court for 3 or 4 years. And eventually it was costing me too much money. And so the judge eventually sentenced me to 3 years in prison. And so I served time in 2 federal prisons, two in Arizona they were. And then I spent time in 3 federal penitentiaries. Latuna, Texas was one. El Reno, Oklahoma was another one. And then I spent 15 months in Springfield, Missouri.
While you were in prison, you had a couple jobs, and you also stole a camera?
Stole a camera?
Yeah.
We just borrowed it.
Same thing. So talk about that.
When I was in prison, because of my conscientious belief, the prison would give us jobs that they felt that they could trust us with, and they couldn't trust other prisoners. I had a job, in fact, I was issued a driver's license, so I drove in and out of the prison. I drove a 2.5-ton truck, and I'd pick up food supplies at warehouses and bring them back. And so I'd go out and come back, every so many days, and they didn't think nothing of it. One day I got the flu, or it was more than a day, but they let this other prisoner who didn't have the belief that I had, let him do the run for me, and he just kept running. He just kept on trucking and never came back. But anyway, that's why if you had, if they knew they could trust you, they'd give you a job that they knew they could trust you at. And so I had that. I also, towards the end of my prison sentence, the prison owned an apartment building. It was outside the walls of the prison, but it was inside the fence. And it was an apartment house that they owned, and I lived in that for a while. And what I did was I took care of the golf course, cut the grass and stuff like that. But it was a nice job. But anyway, it wasn't too rough. But that was the reason why I was in prison. It wasn't that I wanted to disobey the government or anything, but conscientiously I wasn't going to hurt anybody, and I still feel that way. I thought one thing was kind of interesting while we were in prison. I didn't work in the mug area, but a couple of my friends did, and they snuck the camera out one evening, took it to their place of residence, and so at about 2 o'clock in the morning, we all went down into the fire station there that the prison had, and we took you might say, a class picture of all of us. I think there was like 30 of us, close to 30 of us, that we took a picture of. And I smuggled those out. What I did was I had a number of books. You're allowed 7 books when you're in prison. And I took one that was about a foot square, and I took a hot clothes iron and I heated up the inside of it, the backing inside. I was able to peel the book cover back, and then opened up the cover. It was 2 thin pieces of cardboard. And so I opened it up, and then I put the negatives in there. Then I sealed it, heated it up, sealed it all up. And if you want another book, you could get another book, but you had to send one home. Well, you know where that book went. That book went home. And so I got the negatives, and then when I got out of prison, I developed those negatives and had them blown up to about yay big. And so I got that class picture, which is a reminder of the good old days. I went for parole several times, but they denied me parole every time, only if I'd go into the military. And I told them that's why I objected, you know, but they wouldn't listen to me. I finally wrote a letter to the parole board in Washington, and I smuggled it out of prison. And I told them what I thought about the way they were treating me and stuff, you know. And so about 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the parole board in Washington, D.C., and it said to give me immediate release. And so I went home the next day. I got out of prison in April of 68, I think it was, 68. And 2 months later, I married that sweetheart I had. I might mention that we've been married now for 52. We're just months away from our 53rd year of marriage. We've had, and we still have a wonderful marriage. Because we live by Bible principles, we've never been separated a day in our life. That is for problems or anything. Never have, not even one day. We've had a beautiful marriage. We still have a beautiful marriage. We're still madly in love. When I got out of prison, like I said, I got out in 68, and it was 11 months later, I was drafted again. And so I started another legal battle with the legal system and things. I got a lawyer that I was somewhat acquainted with. Lived a couple hours away from me. And as I talked to him about the drafting me again, he said, really, you don't have much to worry about, because what you need to do is you need to appeal for a different classification. Every time they settle an appeal, you need to reappeal for a different classification. And you can appeal for whatever you want. You know, they can't stop you from doing that. But what it does, he said, legally, it stops them from furthering the draft. They can't continue it on until these are all settled. And so immediately you want to reappeal. Because the reason why you want to do that, you're close to the draft age, where they can't touch you or draft you. You'll be over, in a few months you'll be over the age limit. And so that's what I did. I just kept appealing and appealing and appealing. And eventually I reached the age where I was over the draft age, and so I wrote the draft board a nice letter telling them to leave me alone because I'm too old. So that was nice to be that old. When I first got out of prison, I started looking everywhere for a job. I'd fill out applications, and on the applications back then, they had asked, one of the questions was, do you have a felony? And so I couldn't lie about it, so I put down, I had a felony on my record. Of course, you can't explain it to you on that paper. And so when I'd leave the office of whatever place I was trying to get a job, they would tell me, well, we'll get in touch with you. Of course, that never happened, naturally. Eventually, after several months went by, I knew a man that owned a roofing company, and he was looking for a laborer, and so I said I'd take that job. And it wasn't, a high-paying job or anything, but it got me by. But after working for him for a couple of months, I observed fellas that were putting the roofing material on, how they did and stuff, and so I learned how to do it, and I was practicing in the evening at home how to do it, and I got pretty good at it. And so I told him didn't want to do the labor work. I wanted to be a roofer for him, And I told him what that was on the weekends. I was working for another company, and I was roofing. I was making twice the money that I was making doing labor work. So I went to work for him. I went to work as a roofer for him, and like I said, I picked it up very quickly, and I have to admit, I was very fast at it. I could work just 4 hours a day, and you had so many squares that the union required to put on in an 8-hour day. I could do it in 4 hours, and so I made double, triple, sometimes 4 times as much money a day as I made during the labor. So I knew this is what I wanted to do, and so I did it for many, many years, probably 15 years at least, and then I decided I was going to get my license and be my own contractor instead of working with somebody, which I did, which increased my pay a lot, and so I enjoyed doing that. I didn't have to work as much. I did like 3 or 4 jobs a month, and that was all I needed to do. So it lessened my time for other things. As I was growing up, I only remember seeing 2 pictures of my father, and I didn't look nothing like him. He was a Norwegian man. He was over 6 foot tall, blue eyes, blonde hair. My older brother, Arnold Jr., was also over 6 foot tall, blue eyes, blonde hair. But I noticed that I was just barely 5.5 feet tall, dark hair, dark skin, didn't look nothing like him, didn't look nothing like a Norwegian. And so I used to wonder about that, and I remember asking my mom several times, is Arnold my real dad? And she said, yeah, he's your real dad. And I know I look more like my stepdad, I thought, than I did my real dad, but anyway, that's what I was always told. So it didn't stop me wondering about it. I still wondered about it. My stepsisters used to tell me that Arnold wasn't my real dad, but I thought they were just, making it up, But anyway, that's what they used to always tell me. So I never did really, really know. When I got married, my wife and I, we decided we were going to wait to have a family. We were going to enjoy our married life for a while, and sometime later we'd perhaps have a family. I remember I had a niece and her husband who were having all kinds of marital problems, and they had just a child. I can't remember how old he was. I think he just barely walked, but he was just, I don't know, maybe 2 years old. And anyway, he was having problems talking. He would stutter a lot and stuff. And so one day we took him to the doctor. I can't remember why we took him to the doctor. And the doctor noticed that his hair was falling out. And so the doctor said that the environment he's in is not good for him. He said, you need to get him out of that environment. And so we talked to my niece, and we asked if we could raise him for a while until they got their situation straightened out. And she let us. That while went on for about 3 years or so, and we raised him that long. And then one day my niece, after her and her husband divorced, decided she wanted to take him back. So she came and took him back, and my wife was, she just couldn't hardly take it because she got so used to having a child. So we decided that we would have our own children. And so that's when we started having a family. And we had, this was after 11 years of marriage, we had one child, and then that was our daughter. And then 3 years later, we had our older son, that's you. And then, I don't know, about 6 years later after that, we had our younger son, Darren. And we've had a wonderful family. we're a very close family. I know my wife and I, when we first talked about having children, it's interesting. I wasn't sure about my father. She wasn't sure about who her father was either. And so we decided that when we had children, they were going to know who their parents were. And they were going to be raised by their parents all through life, which we did. Now, all my life, I really wondered who my real father was. I knew Jack was my stepfather. I know he wasn't. Arnold, I questioned that because we looked nothing alike, you know, and he never showed any interest in it. He left when I was probably about 3 years old. I never heard from him, never got a phone call, letter, anything, never visited, so that gave me more doubt that he was my father.
You know, growing up, a lot of people questioned my ethnicity. You know, they would look at me and they say, "You're Mexican and what? You're Mexican and white?" And I would tell them no, that as far as what I knew, I was German, Norwegian, Welsh, and Portuguese. And now I knew there was always question about my dad's father, if his father was Arnold or not. It was a couple years ago where I found a picture of my dad's stepfather, Jack, and upon looking at that picture, I thought it was a dead ringer for my father. Now, granted, I never met my grandfather, Jack. He passed away 2 months before I was born. But, you know, they had the same dark skin, the dark hair, you know, brown eyes. Much different from the pale Norwegian man who we were always told was my dad's father. I knew if one day I decided to set out and take a DNA test, that if my DNA results came back Norwegian or if they came back Mexican and Native American, then I could distinguish who my dad's real father was. But I was always a little iffy about taking these tests. One day we had some friends come over and I was telling her my theory that if I took the test and if I showed that I was Norwegian or Mexican and Native American, then I could figure out who my dad's actual father was. But then I told her that I wouldn't take it, that, you know, needless to say, one day she shows up at my door with a test and demands that I take the test. So I finally take the test, and it was 6 weeks later I get the result. I was out of town and I was driving back home from a meeting. It was 4 a.m. and I get a text message that says your ancestry results are in. And, you know, it gives me it shows me a list of these different nationalities, and I figured that was a sample test, and I had to open it up online to get in there further to actually see what nationalities that I am. When I opened it up online, nothing had changed.
And then one day my son came over, and he had just had taken that DNA test, that Ancestry DNA test thing. And my wife always thought she was Portuguese. Her last name being Silva, her maiden name. And I always figured I was Norwegian. That's what I was told, Nelson. But he comes over and he says, I got news for you guys. He says, I have no Portuguese in me. I have no Norwegian in me. And the first thing I thought, man, we took the wrong baby home, you know. But anyway, that wasn't the case. He looked just like me.
It said that I was Jewish, English, Welsh, and Scottish. Much different from the German, Norwegian, Welsh, Portuguese that I was always told. So that means Arnold wasn't my dad's father, and that means Jack wasn't my dad's father. So I was left with a question of who is my dad's father? And better yet, what nationality is my dad?
Now, when Aaron got his results back, he noticed that he was Jewish, and so he wondered which side of the family it came from. Did it come from me, or did it come from my wife's side? So he never knew, so that's why he wanted us to take the test, so we took the test.
Ancestry matches you with DNA matches. And I would go through and I would pick a cousin, and then I would see the shared matches. And I would look at this one line, and then I can distinguish that, okay, all these cousins of mine come from my mother's mom's side. And I would see another line, a cousin I would click, and all the shared matches, and then I can distinguish that that came from my dad's mom's side. But then there was these two other lines that I couldn't distinguish, where these people came from. So I picked the Jewish side to figure out which parent that came from. So I clicked on my nearest relative on the Jewish side, whose name on there was Lamar Owitz, I believe it was. And I tried to find out everything I could about that guy. Finally, I narrowed it down that it wasn't Lamar Owitz, it was actually Leonard Merowitz. So I started doing my research on Leonard. I found out that Leonard's dad's name was Morris. I found out Morris's dad's name was Frank. I found out Frank's dad's name was Yankel. And from Yankel, I can start building down over to where I would land into a third cousin position. I got real interested in this line of people who were Jacob and Anna Meyerowitz. And so I started looking at all the children that they had. The biggest problem that I found is nobody from this family left New York. And I needed to place them in Long Beach, California in 1943. And there was nothing that showed me that they ever left New York. So then I find myself at a standstill, not knowing what to do. And I decided, well, I'm going to narrow this down, and I'm going to have my mom and dad both take these tests. When I first got my results back as being Jewish, I emailed Leonard, or I sent him a message on Ancestry, seeing if he could help me with the Jacob and Anna line, because I knew that that's where I came from, was the Jacob and Anna line. And I didn't hear nothing back from him. I remember one night I'm laying there on the bed, and I get a text message saying Don's Ancestry results are in.
When my test came back, I was predominant Jewish, so we knew that the Jewish came from my side.
So I open them up and I look, and it shows Leonard and my dad are first cousins. And so right away I knew that my grandfather and Leonard's dad had to have been brothers. So since I already built up the family tree, I started tracking the family tree backwards to where I originally started from, and tried to see which one of Leonard's dad's brothers, which one of Leonard's uncles left New Jersey, who possibly made it out to Long Beach, California. You know, at about 10 years ago at my uncle's funeral, a family member comes up to us and says, "Look at this photo. This looks just like you. This is your dad's father." And of course it was met with skepticism. But I took a picture of that photo that day, and I held on to it because I did bear a resemblance to this man. It always stayed in my mind that who was this man? You know, my grandma was very meticulous when she had photos. She would write down who was in the photo, the date that this photo was taken, where this photo was taken at, and yet the backside of this photo was blank. It was very unlike her to leave a photo blank, and so it had my concern. Now, interesting enough, that photo that I received at my uncle's funeral, that photo was of 3 men in the military. And I often did all kinds of research on those 3 men. I did research on their uniforms, and it shows that they were in the Army Air Corps. And doing some research on my grandmother, I don't know exactly what she did, but I knew she worked in some type of airplane factory in Long Beach, California. So I looked at Lynn's uncles in the family tree, and I seen 2 of them who were enlisted in the service in World War II. It didn't say where they went. One of them seemed to be a little bit young. There was another one by the name of Alex who seemed to be closer to my grandmother's age. And so he was a man of some concern that if possibly he was my grandfather. So I look up Lynn's contact information because I'm going to call him this time. I'm not going to send him an email. I want to make sure that he gets my message. So I'm going to call him and talk to him. But I don't want to get straight to the point because I don't want to scare him off. So I'm going to beat around the bush a little bit and ask him, what does it mean to be Jewish, since, you know, this is the first time in my life that I've ever been Jewish that I know of. So I wait for the next day to call him, and I call him. You know, I got butterflies in my stomach. I know I'm going to drop a bomb on this guy, and I don't know how he's going to take it. And so I call him, and I don't get him right away. I get his answering machine, and 2 hours later I get a phone call back from that number. And, you know, he says, initially I know you wanted to know about the Jacob and Anna line. And I said I did when Ancestry predicted you and I as third cousins. However, my father took the test and his results came back last night, and it shows you and him as first cousins. And Len says, oh, so that means your grandfather is one of my uncles. And so he starts thinking, and he says, I do have an uncle that was stationed in Southern California. And so since I already built a family tree, I asked him, I said, is his name Alex? He said, yeah, my Uncle Al. My Uncle Al was stationed in Southern California. He was in the Army Air Corps. And I said, I have a picture that I want you to look at. Do you have an email address that I can send it to? And so he gives me his email address, and I send him this photo, and he calls me back about a half hour later and says, you see that man all the way on the right? He says, I believe that's my Uncle Al.
He was 75 years had gone by, and I always wondered who my father was. I never figured I would ever learn who he was. Sorry.
So we get to talking about his family history, and he lets me know that his Uncle Al never had kids. And I said, well, here's the kicker, my dad is a twin. He proceeds to tell me that his Uncle Al just died a few years beforehand, so we just barely missed meeting him. He proceeds to tell me about the family business, that my great-grandfather, Frank, was a tailor, opened up a clothing store. He let me know Frank was from Russia. Now now it's considered Ukraine. And Frank was drafted for military service in the Tsar's army. And back in those days, when a Jew was drafted to the Tsar's army, they got a one-way ticket to Siberia. And so Frank snuck out of Ukraine and came to the United States in 1910. Me and Lynn both wanted to be positively sure that Al was my dad's father. And so I tried to find every piece of information that I can possibly find to send to him. While looking up our family online, I managed to come across the family's tailor shop that's still in business. And listed on that website, there was a photo of Al, and it was the same photo that I had of Al that I was given at the funeral. My initial response was, oh no, I'm going to look like a fraud. This photo that I had is out there somewhere else, that anybody can pull this photo and say, do you know who this is? I believe this is a family relative of mine. And I remember having conversations with my mom, and my mom said one cousin sent her a photo that she believed was my dad's father. And I asked my mom, I said, Mom, can you find that photo for me? And she says, yeah, I'll look for it later. I said, Mom, can you please find it now? And so she found it. She did a little looking, and she found it. And sure enough, it was Al Marowitz. On the back, it was signed with a message that he called my grandma by Babe, which only people that really knew my grandma called her by her nickname, Babe. So Len drafted up an email to send out to all of my dad's newfound first cousins, and let them know of the previous month's research that we've been into and the results of our research. It was very overwhelming to read that. It was just, all this this research that you put into it, and everything finally came true. So I found out who my dad's father was, and I still had questions on how they met. We found a newspaper clipping of my grandmother who worked at Douglas Aircraft Corporation in 1943. So I decided to look up the address of Douglas in 1943. And it shows that Douglas was situated right where the airport is currently at in Long Beach. I also decided to look up where the Air Corps did most of their training at in Long Beach. And it showed them split up between the airport and over at the Naval Shipyard. And oddly enough, I managed to find a yearbook of the 6 ferrying group during those years, and I decided to look on it. And sure enough, when I get to page 130, I see a man there who, resembles my father, and I knew right away that that's how they met. My grandma and grandfather met over there at the airport where she was working, and he was on assignment. Deciding to know more about my history, where we came from, I looked into Frank, my great-grandfather, and I actually found the manifest of him coming over on the SS Neapolitan Prince in 1910, coming to the United States through Ellis Island. And a few months after that, his wife came over on the SS Estonia. All this time, you never really know how important identity is until you find it.
As I was growing up, my mother never told us who my real father was. Every time I'd ask her, she'd mention Arnold Nelson. So I kind of grew up thinking he was my father. But after my son took that DNA test, he came back and told us that I was a Jewish descent, and then he started searching for my real father, and he was able to find him finally. After 75 years, he was able to find my father. And his name was Alex Morowitz, a Jewish man. And since then, he's been doing research, and he's got in touch with a number of the relatives. I have 10 first cousins and a number of second cousins. And I met, not personally, I met some of them personally. Several of them have been out here from New Jersey, or one was out from New Jersey. And I found out I had one living in Sacramento, and we met many, many times. We've gone to dinner a lot and stuff. And so I was very happy to know that I had family. And even though I never did get to know my father, he died just 3 years before I found out who he was, at the age of 99. So it's been some very good things. I can't believe how wonderful the family is. They're so kind and so generous. We've come to love them even though we haven't met all of them. But it's a wonderful family that I came from.
All the things we thought would count, they have no meaning to us now. All we got is who we have inside our homes. But tell me, when this is done and we go back to life, will we remember these days forever? Will we go back to our ways? Oh, will we remember these days forever? Will we go back to our ways? So let's try our best to keep a smile. I know it's been a little while, but when we return, we'll sing this song together.